Hey, this is Josh with Budget Mechanic. In this video, I want to show you how to diagnose and repair problems with your electric windows. So I'm going to be covering the most common issues that you'd have, which are going to be regulator and motor. But before you get tearing into your door, you want to make sure you check your fuses and relays to eliminate that first. So every car's electrical window system is going to be a little bit different. So when you're about to work on a window, what can really help is to look up the parts online so you can get a picture of what you're dealing with first. So here's how it works. Every car is going to have a window that sits down inside your door when it's rolled down, and it has a mechanism, usually kind of all built together, and the glass is attached, usually by some form of mounting holes, to a tray that raises and lowers. So this is the motor and regulator assembly. Some of the older styles used more like scissor lift metal tracks and stuff, but essentially all the same, a motor driving a lifting mechanism. So the most common problem we all have is when our electric windows doesn't move. It doesn't go up and doesn't go down. So more often than not, it's a bad motor, right? But the motor's burned out and won't lift the track up and down. Now, alternatively, it could be the connection between the motor and the regulator, which is often a plastic gear, which can get stripped. And then the motor will spin, but the regulator will not be lifting up and down. If this is the case, oftentimes you'll hear the motor running inside the door, but nothing's happening. Another thing that is very common is the regulator itself will break. That can be plastic parts snapping off out of their housing. It can be the cables actually breaking. It can be any number of things that will cause the regulator to not pull this tray up and down. Also, sometimes what happens is your window will go up and down really slowly. This can be a dying motor, or it can also be the window itself is getting jammed inside of the tracks inside the window frame. Obstructions will make the glass go up and down slowly. So another thing that can happen is your window will be crooked inside of your window frame, or it'll actually fall off the track and go all the way to the bottom of your door and not come back up. This can be a problem with the actual mounting points where it attaches to the regulator. Often it's, again, plastic clips, and they snap off, and then the window is no longer attached to the tray, whatever it may be, and it'll get crooked or fall off. Sometimes with systems like this, you can buy individual parts, whether it be a motor or clips or the regulator. But often, if the price is similar enough, I'll just buy the whole unit as one, because if one's going, usually something else is about to break as well. Okay, let's get started pulling this thing apart. So obviously our window and motors and everything is going to be behind our door panel, so that's the first order of business. Now, this is a 2016 Hyundai Accent door, but pretty much all doors are going to have the same basic attachment points. Some sort of attachment behind the handle, one right behind where you grab, and then the bottom is going to have usually press fittings in it. And then depending on your model, you'll probably have some hidden screws here and there. So understandably, the automakers try to hide the fasteners of a door to make it look pretty. So you usually have to deal with some sort of cover or cap. And often they have a little slot. Okay, a lot of cars have this, this corner piece, which is usually a speaker. And oftentimes it's just a pop-out fitting. So you take a screwdriver or something and get it in behind the plastic. And so for parts that you have to pop plastic fittings out, they do make tools that you can remove door panels with without damaging any of the plastic. But for me, a screwdriver works pretty good, and I'm not worried about little nicks in the plastic. But if that's something you're concerned about, go get some tools. Take a look around, make sure there's no more hidden screws under these covers. A lot of manufacturers like to put them here, more screws. So just take a good look all the way around the plastic underneath, make sure you're not missing anything that's gonna break. And one quick note, I found a tricky spot on a lot of cars, especially like Hondas. They'll have a separate plastic panel for the switches that you have to pop out to access this grab handle screw. So if you really can't find it, try looking under the switches. So I'm moving down to the bottom. So I'm gonna give just a little pop out and then move screwdriver up, pop out. Okay, so once you can get your fingers in there, you can start popping around the edges. So now the whole thing's kind of swinging free with no binding points. Just to be safe, I'm going to pull this little piece out. Looks like I have all my fasteners, so I'm going to lift the door up. and off. So there's usually like a hook that runs along the whole top edge that hooks over the top of the door. You gotta lift up and out. On some cars, this door latch assembly is actually attached to the inside of the door panel, and you'll need to disconnect the cables or remove the latch from the inside of the panel in order to remove it. So before you put this door panel down or take it away, you're gonna have to disconnect some wires for the lights in the door if you have any, or the switches. So they're just like any automotive plug. They got a tab somewhere on them. You got to push down before you can wiggle them out, like that tab there. Same deal. Okay, so I can set the panel aside. I'm going to keep it close because if I need to raise or lower the window or run the motor, I'm going to need the switch to do it. If you've got this plastic rain sealant, you can just yank that off and reuse it later. On a lot of cars nowadays, instead of this plastic covering, it'll actually have a full metal inner panel. So it's basically all this would be covered up, and you would have maybe 15, 20 screws around the outside, and you'd have to remove that panel. But on this car, that panel or that part is fixed. It's part of the door, so it's going to stay, and you get access holes to all the different parts of the window. Working on electric car windows used to be one of my least favorite jobs on a car because I was always trying to replace one element at a time, and it's really cramped, really hard to get things in and out. So I found the easiest thing to do is just pull that glass out, pull the whole thing out, and work on it outside of the car. It just makes everything so much simpler. And the first thing I'm doing is just checking for really obvious signs. Cables hanging loose, or maybe water got in and stuff is soaked in water. If I don't see anything obvious, the next thing I want to do is, if possible, test my motor electrically before I take anything off. So on this one, it's pretty nice and easy to get to the plug, disconnect the plug. Most window motors are going to have a 2-prong plug, which is great because you can actually test the voltage coming in. And with a voltmeter or a test light and my window switch hooked back up, I can click the switch and see if power is coming to this motor. On some of the newer cars, it's not possible to check for this because it's more computerized, especially if you have like that auto roll up or auto down feature. That throws another electrical wrench in things, and it doesn't actually give you a conclusive test here, but it's worth a shot. So once I've figured out that my motor's okay, I'm just gonna pull the window out and get it out of the way to make more room to look at the other stuff. So in order to take the glass out, we're gonna need to remove the retaining bolts at the bottom. So depending on how your window is set up, they have attachment points along the bottom of the glass, sometimes in a tray. In order to remove those attachment points, you need to raise the window to the level where the bolts coincide with access holes in the paneling. So sometimes it'll be a big hole like this, other times it'll be just little holes that match the spacing of the bolts that you need to remove, and you got to get the window up to that level. Sometimes you have to remove the car speaker in order to access certain bolts or remove certain parts. So just keep that in mind. If it's like this one, where it's riveted in, chances are good you don't have to touch it. So I could pull this switch assembly out, but there's a lot of little screws that I don't want to deal with, so I'm going to plug my... So make sure your motor's plugged in. So put the key in the accessory position. So now you should be able to move the window. So if your motor was dead and you weren't able to raise the glass up to that point to be able to remove it, you may have to skip ahead and start removing the motor and or the regulator in the door to allow you to lift the whole system up in order to reach those bolts. So now that I've brought the window up and I can actually see the retaining piece that holds the glass, this is where I'm going to look for broken or missing parts, which is what would lead to my window sitting crooked or falling all the way down. So now the window is free. This is where I would check to make sure that the runners that the window rides on are all clear and that there's no binding when the window goes up and down. So I'm going to kind of manually raise and lower the window by hand and just make sure nothing's hitting, nothing's catching, pinching. Old weather stripping will fold over and block it, and that's why you'll get a window that raises really slowly, and that will actually burn out your motor pretty quick as well. This one's feeling pretty good, sliding well, so I'm going to remove the little clips and pull the glass out. So this style of clip is 2 parts. Just pop the back off, and then the front comes. Next, I'm going to move to the motor. On some doors, it's really hard to tell where the motor is when all you can see is this metal panel. You're looking for 3 bolts, usually kind of evenly spaced. Okay, so the motor is now loose in here. This is one reason I like to take the glass out first, because I don't want this banging around on my glass and scratching or breaking it. So now I'm going to work on the regulator. So 2 nuts at the top and 2 nuts at the bottom. Okay, now that I have the regulator and motor out, I can kind of inspect it for damage. The most common break areas, these cables will break, or the plastic fittings will come out of their holes because they're old and brittle and they crack. So it's usually pretty obvious when a regulator is gone. Just a note, this is a properly working regulator, and you can tell all the cables are tight. Nothing should be slack. The whole thing should be nice and firm all around. So it's often bad regulators will pull apart just enough that the cables come slack, and then they're no good. The next thing I want to do is, on most of these systems, you can actually remove 3 screws and pull the motor away from the regulator, because another common break point is the gearing in between the two. Okay. Whether the regulator is built into the door or it's its own separate unit, it's usually driven by a plastic gear that often will strip out. If the window binds for some reason, usually one of the things to go is this plastic gearing. That's a case where you'll have a motor that works and you can hear it spinning, but the window is not going up or down. Once you get everything out, replace the part you need. It's essentially put things back the way that you took them apart. A couple little notes. You can reuse this plastic with the goop. Just kind of put it back where it was, pat it into place. And then those press fittings on the door panels, you're going to get everything situated, hook on the top, put your screws in, and then you just give it a little pound around the edge and those clips will pop right in. Now there are some exotic cars out there that have a completely different system than what we talked about here, but for the majority of you, this is what you're going to see in your vehicle. Thanks for watching. I hope this was helpful. Please subscribe and we'll see you next time.